Baltimore, 1996. An 18-year-old girl with a bright future vanished on a rainy night. The police, quick to judge, labeled her a runaway, and her case went cold. For 12 years, her mother walked past a neighbor's house on her way to work, never knowing her daughter was chained in an upstairs room, just 2 streets from home. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The summer of 1996 was a season of profound and shimmering promise for 18-year-old Danielle Carter. It was a summer that smelled of fresh-cut grass, asphalt after a thunderstorm, and the sweet, dusty scent of old books. Having just graduated from high school with honors, Danielle stood on the precipice of her adult life, a future she had meticulously planned in the neatly ruled pages of her ever-present journal. Her world was one of quiet ambition, of dreams that were not wild or flamboyant, but were steady, achievable, and deeply felt. She was going to be a teacher. She was going to enroll in the early childhood education program at the local community college in the fall. A first, concrete step on a path she had chosen for herself years ago. Danielle was the anchor in her small family's world. She lived with her mother, Gloria, in a modest but impeccably neat row house in a working-class Baltimore neighborhood. Gloria was a registered nurse, a woman of immense strength and pragmatism who worked long, grueling hours to provide for her only child. In their quiet, 2-person household, Danielle was the steady one, while Gloria was the whirlwind of energy, the force of nature who kept their lives afloat. Danielle was the calm, predictable center. She was the one who made sure the bills were organized, who started dinner on the nights her mother worked a double shift, who reminded Gloria to take a breath and sit down for a minute. Her passions were quiet ones. She didn't go to loud parties or run with a wild crowd. Her greatest joy was to be found in the hushed, sacred aisles of the neighborhood public library. She was a voracious reader, a girl who could lose herself for hours in the worlds created by others. But she was also a creator of her own. Her journal was her most prized possession, a place where she not only recorded the events of her day, but where she built her future, one carefully chosen word at a time. She wrote about the kind of teacher she wanted to be: patient, kind, the kind who noticed the quiet kids in the back of the classroom. She wrote about the small, simple life she hoped to build for herself and her mother. Her world was a map of familiar, comforting routines. The walk to the library, her part-time job shelving books, the quiet evenings spent with her mother, their easy conversation, a warm, familiar melody in the small house. She was not a girl with secrets. She was not a girl prone to drama or rebellion. She was a girl who was deeply loved, and who loved deeply in return. She was a girl who was, by all accounts, on the precipice of a life of quiet, meaningful purpose. A life that was about to be stolen from her, not by a shadowy figure in a dark alley, but by a familiar face from her own neighborhood, a man whose ordinariness was the most terrifying mask of all. The rain began in the late afternoon, a soft, persistent drizzle that quickly thickened into a heavy, determined downpour. It was a classic Baltimore summer storm, the kind that turned the streets into dark, shimmering rivers and filled the air with the clean, earthy smell of wet pavement. For Danielle Carter, who was finishing her shift at the library, it was an inconvenience. She had forgotten her umbrella, and the walk home, usually a pleasant, 15-minute stroll, now seemed like a daunting journey. She stood for a moment under the library's stone portico, watching the rain, debating whether to wait it out or make a run for it. The library was closing. She had to go. Pulling her thin jacket tighter and clutching her precious journal to her chest to protect it from the water, she took a deep breath and plunged into the storm. The streets were mostly empty, the rain having driven everyone indoors. The world was a blur of hazy streetlights and the rhythmic, percussive drumming of the rain on the pavement. She was halfway home, her hair plastered to her head and her sneakers soaked through, when a familiar, slightly battered pickup truck slowed and pulled up to the curb beside her. The driver's side window rolled down, and a familiar face leaned out. It was Harold Whitman, a man from the neighborhood. He was in his 40s, with a round, pleasant face and the calloused, capable hands of a man who worked with tools for a living. Harold was a local handyman, a fixture in the community. He was the man you called to fix a leaky pipe or patch a fence. He had even done some work on their own house a few years back, fixing a stubborn jam in their back door. He was not a stranger. He was a known quantity, a part of the familiar, trusted fabric of her world. "Danielle, that you?" he called out over the sound of the rain, his voice a friendly, concerned baritone. "You're gonna catch your death out here in this mess. Get in. I'll give you a ride home. It's no trouble at all." Danielle hesitated for only a second. The ingrained warnings about getting into cars with strangers were a distant echo. Harold Whitman wasn't a stranger. He was a neighbor. She had seen him 100 times, mowing his lawn, carrying his toolbox, offering a friendly wave. In the context of the cold, driving rain, his offer seemed like a simple, neighborly act of kindness. The trust she placed in him was not a naive, childish trust in a stranger. It was a communal trust, a belief in the safety of her own neighborhood, in the goodness of a familiar face. "Are you sure, Mr. Whitman? I don't want to be a bother," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Nonsense. Get in before you're soaked to the bone," he insisted, leaning over and pushing the passenger door open for her. With a grateful smile, she climbed into the dry, warm cab of the truck. The interior smelled of sawdust, oil, and old coffee. It was the smell of a working man's truck, a smell that was somehow reassuring in its ordinariness. "Thank you so much," she said, pulling the door shut. "You're a lifesaver." "Don't mention it," he said, his eyes crinkling in a friendly smile as he pulled away from the curb. "Can't have Gloria's good girl getting sick, can we?" The first few minutes of the drive were entirely normal. He asked her about her plans for college, making the kind of polite, avuncular small talk she would expect from a neighbor. He was easy to talk to, and she found herself relaxing, grateful for this small act of kindness. He turned onto her street, and for a moment, she felt the familiar, comforting sense of being almost home. But instead of pulling up in front of her row house, he kept driving, slowly passing it. "Oh, you missed it," she said, a note of confusion in her voice. "It was that one back there." "I know," he said, his voice suddenly losing its friendly warmth. It was flat, calm, and chillingly devoid of emotion. "Just need to grab a tool from my place at the end of the block. Dropped it off this morning. It'll only take a second." It was a plausible explanation. His house was just 2 streets over. But a small, cold knot of unease began to form in Danielle's stomach. The shift in his tone, the sudden coldness in his eyes, was a jarring, discordant note. He pulled up in front of his own neat, unremarkable row house and killed the engine. "Won't be a minute," he said, getting out of the truck. Instead of going to the back of the truck for a tool, he walked to her passenger door and opened it. "Why don't you come in out of the rain for a second while I find it?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet, firm command. The knot of unease in her stomach tightened into a knot of pure, cold terror. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. She looked into his eyes and saw that the friendly, helpful neighbor was gone. In his place was a stranger, a man with a look of calm, absolute, and terrifying resolve. "No, that's okay," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. "I'll just wait here." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into the cab, his movements swift and practiced, and grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron. Before she could scream, before she could process the sudden, violent shift in her reality, he was pulling her out of the truck and up the short walkway to his front door. The rain, which had been a simple nuisance just minutes before, was now the soundtrack to a nightmare, washing over a quiet residential street where a young woman's life was being stolen in plain, silent sight. Gloria Carter's world operated on a rhythm of quiet, predictable certainties. She knew that her shift at the hospital ended at 7, that the bus ride home took 22 minutes, and that when she walked through her front door, the first thing she would see was her daughter, Danielle, sitting at the kitchen table, a book open, a quiet smile of welcome on her face. This was the bedrock of her reality, the unshakable foundation upon which she had built her life. On that rainy Tuesday evening, the foundation cracked. She walked into the house at 7:30, later than usual due to the storm-slowed traffic, and the house was silent. The kitchen table was empty. A single cold lamp cast long shadows across the living room. "Danny?" she called out, her voice echoing in the unnerving quiet. "I'm home." There was no answer. The first, logical explanations came quickly, a parent's rational defense against the encroaching tide of fear. Danielle was still at the library, waiting out the worst of the storm. Her shift had run late. She had stopped at a friend's house on the way home. Gloria walked through the small house, her sense of unease growing with each empty room. She saw Danielle's work clothes for the next day laid out neatly on her bed. She saw her college application forms, filled out in her perfect, precise handwriting, sitting on her desk. This was not the room of a girl who had made spontaneous plans. She picked up the phone and called the library. A tired voice from the circulation desk informed her that the library had closed on time, at 6 o'clock. She called Danielle's best friend, who hadn't heard from her since that morning. With each call, another rational explanation was stripped away, leaving behind the raw, terrifying core of the truth. Her daughter was not where she was supposed to be. By 9 o'clock, the unease had metastasized into a full-blown, suffocating panic. Gloria was a nurse. She had seen the worst of what a city could do to a person. Her mind, usually a place of calm, clinical assessment, became a torture chamber of horrific possibilities. She began to bargain with a God she wasn't sure she believed in, making desperate, silent promises in exchange for the sound of her daughter's key in the lock. At 10 o'clock, her hands shaking, she called the police. The voice on the other end of the line was professional, detached, and followed a script. The questions were a cold, bureaucratic checklist that felt insultingly inadequate in the face of her terror. Name, age, height, weight. When was she last seen? "She's 18, Gloria explained, her voice cracking. "But she's not. She wouldn't just leave. She's not that kind of girl. She was supposed to be home hours ago. Something is wrong. I know something is wrong." The dispatcher's response was a placid, procedural calm that felt like a physical blow. "Ma'am, at 18 years old, your daughter is a legal adult. We can file a missing persons report, but unless there is evidence of foul play, she is considered to be missing voluntarily." Voluntarily. The word was a slap in the face. It was a neat, bureaucratic label that completely erased the daughter she knew. It ignored Danielle's reliability, her dreams, her deep, abiding love for her mother. In the eyes of the system, her daughter was not a victim. She was just another statistic, another kid who had decided to run off. Gloria's fear was now joined by a new, hot, and powerful emotion: rage. A rage at a system that was so quick to dismiss her daughter, to paint her with the broad, careless brush of a stereotype. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper that held more power than a scream. "I am her mother. I know my child. She did not run away. Someone has her. And if you don't do something, you will be just as responsible as the person who took her." Her words had an effect. A patrol car was dispatched, but the seed of the official narrative had been planted. The story that would define the next 12 years of her life, the story she would have to fight against with every fiber of her being, had already been written. Her daughter was not missing. She was just another runaway. The Danielle Carter case landed on the desk of Detective Frank Russo the next morning. It was just another thin manila folder in a thick, teetering stack of them, a single sad story in a city that produced them with an industrial efficiency. Russo, a 20-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Department, was a man who had long ago learned to shield himself with a thick, calloused layer of professional cynicism. It was the only way to survive in a job where the daily diet was human misery. He scanned the preliminary report with a practiced, weary eye. 18-year-old female, no sign of forced entry at the home, no witnesses to an abduction, no history of mental illness. A single mother who claimed her daughter wasn't the type. He had heard that 100 times before. In his experience, every parent said that, right before their kid turned up 3 states away with a new boyfriend. The statistics were grimly, reliably predictable. The overwhelming majority of missing person cases involving legal adults, especially those from tough, low-income neighborhoods, resolved themselves in one of 2 ways. They came home on their own, or they were never found because they didn't want to be. The third option, a stranger abduction, was a statistical anomaly, a headline-grabbing rarity that was far more common on television than it was on the streets of Baltimore. Russo was a man who played the odds. His caseload was crushing. In the past week alone, he had been assigned 2 homicides, a string of armed robberies, and a brutal domestic violence case. He had to allocate his time and resources to the cases where there was a real, tangible threat, a clear and present danger. A potential runaway, no matter how distraught the mother was, simply did not meet that threshold. He made the call to Gloria Carter, his voice a tired, professional monotone. He recited the official line, "Mrs. Carter, I understand your concern, but at this time, there is no evidence to suggest foul play. Your daughter is an adult. We have entered her into the National Missing Persons Database. If she has any contact with law enforcement anywhere in the country, we will be notified. For now, we are classifying this as a voluntary missing person case." Gloria's response was a raw, guttural cry of disbelief and fury. "Voluntary? Did you hear a word I said? My daughter had plans. She had a life. She wouldn't just walk away from it. You have to look for her. We have patrol officers keeping an eye out," Russo said, the words a hollow, inadequate placation. "If any new information comes to light, you will be the first to know." He hung up the phone with a sigh, already moving on to the next file, the next tragedy. He had made a judgment call, a decision based on experience, on statistics, on the grim, triage-based logic of an overwhelmed city detective. He had not been malicious. He had not been lazy. He had simply been wrong. And that single, flawed assumption, made in a cluttered office on a busy Wednesday morning, had just condemned Danielle Carter to a silent, unseen hell. It was a decision that would not come back to haunt him for 12 years, but when it did, it would be the defining, soul-crushing failure of his entire career. He had closed the book on Danielle Carter before the first chapter of her nightmare had even truly begun. Danielle's first sensation upon waking was one of profound, disorienting confusion. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from the back of her head, and the air was thick with the unfamiliar, musty smell of dust and damp plaster. She was lying on a thin, lumpy mattress on a hard wooden floor. For a fleeting, merciful moment, she had no memory of how she had gotten there. Then, the events of the previous evening came rushing back with a horrifying, brutal clarity. The rain, the familiar, smiling face of Harold Whitman, the sudden, cold shift in his eyes, the iron grip on her arm, the horrifying, sickening realization that she had not been rescued from the storm, but had been delivered into the heart of a far more terrible one. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was in a small, square room, a bedroom, but it was a bedroom that had been converted into a prison cell. The single window was not made of glass, but of thick, cloudy plexiglass, with heavy iron bars bolted to the frame on the outside. The door was solid wood, with no handle on the inside, only a small sliding panel at the bottom. A heavy, industrial-grade deadbolt was visible on the outside of the door jamb, and then she felt the weight. A cold, heavy, and undeniable weight on her left ankle. She looked down and saw a thick, metal cuff, connected by a short, heavy chain to a large iron ring that was bolted directly into the hardwood floor in the center of the room. The reality of her situation was absolute, inescapable, and utterly terrifying. This was not a temporary misunderstanding. This was a cage that had been meticulously and patiently prepared for her. The man who had done this, the friendly neighborhood handyman, was not an impulsive opportunist. He was a methodical, calculating predator. The days that followed were a blur of terror and disbelief. Harold Whitman's routine was chillingly mundane. Twice a day, the bolt on the door would slide back, and he would enter. He would place a tray of simple, unappetizing food and a plastic bottle of water on the floor, just out of her reach, forcing her to strain at the end of her chain to get it. He rarely spoke. The friendly, avuncular persona was gone, replaced by a silent, watchful presence. He was her jailer, her sole source of sustenance, the absolute, unquestioned god of her small, terrifying world. The room itself became the entire universe. She learned its geography with an obsessive, desperate attention to detail. The faded floral pattern of the wallpaper peeling in one corner, the water stain on the ceiling that looked, if she squinted, like a map of a strange, unknown continent. The way the light shifted through the cloudy plexiglass window, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that was her only way of telling the difference between day and night. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the distant, muffled sounds of a life being lived just beyond her prison walls. She could hear the faint drone of a television, the sound of footsteps on the floor below, the distant, cheerful ringing of an ice cream truck in the late afternoon. These small, ordinary sounds of the outside world were a form of exquisite torture, a constant, taunting reminder of the life that had been so cruelly stolen from her. In the first few weeks, she screamed. She screamed until her throat was raw, until her voice was a hoarse, ragged whisper. She rattled her chain. She beat her fists against the solid wood of the door, but no one came. The room was a soundproof box, her cries for help swallowed by the thick plaster walls. Her defiance only earned her a cold, silent punishment from Whitman, the withholding of food, of water, of the small, human dignities that were her only connection to her former self. She quickly learned that resistance was futile, that her survival depended on a quiet, submissive compliance. The initial, fiery terror began to cool, replaced by a cold, hard, and deeply pragmatic resolve. The bright, hopeful 18-year-old girl who loved books and dreamed of being a teacher was being systematically broken down. But as she was broken, something else, something harder and more resilient, began to form in her place. She was no longer just Danielle. She was a survivor, and her new life, her only life, was the upstairs prison. From the window of his small, neatly kept row house, Harold Whitman had a clear, unobstructed view of the quiet, unremarkable street he had lived on for over 20 years. He was, to all who knew him, a model of quiet, boring respectability. He was a man who lived a life of predictable, comforting routines. He rose at the same time every morning, drank his coffee black, and read the morning paper. He spent his days working as a self-employed handyman, his battered pickup truck a familiar sight in the driveways of his neighbors. He was known for his fair prices, his meticulous work, and his friendly, if slightly reserved, demeanor. This was the man the world saw. This was the mask he had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was a mask of such profound, unassailable normalcy that it was his greatest asset, his most powerful weapon. It allowed him to move through the world, completely unseen for what he truly was. His life was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. In one part of his mind, he was Harold Whitman, the reliable handyman, the good neighbor. In another, a dark, locked, and secret part, he was a monster. The two identities existed side by side, never overlapping, never touching. He could spend an afternoon cheerfully helping an elderly neighbor fix her screen door, making polite small talk about the weather, and then go home, climb the stairs, and slide the bolt on the door to his upstairs prison, the transition seamless, effortless, and utterly devoid of any cognitive dissonance. The girl, Danielle, was his greatest secret, his most prized possession. She was an exercise in absolute control, a living testament to his own cleverness, his own superiority. The act of keeping her, of maintaining this incredible, high-stakes secret just a few hundred feet from the prying eyes of the world, gave him a quiet, thrilling sense of power that he had never known in his mundane, ordinary life. He took a perverse, sadistic pleasure in the sheer, horrifying proximity of his crime. He knew who her mother, Gloria, was. He had seen her around the neighborhood for years. He knew she was a nurse. He knew she was a single mother. He had chosen Danielle not at random, but with a cold, calculating precision. He had chosen her because she was close, because she was known, and because her disappearance from this tight-knit community would be a source of constant, delicious irony for him. He would see Gloria on the street sometimes. He would watch her from his window as she walked to the bus stop on her way to work, her face a mask of weary, determined grief. He would see her putting up the missing person flyers, the ones with Danielle's bright, smiling high school graduation photo. He would sometimes be working in a neighbor's yard when she walked by, and he would offer her a polite, sympathetic nod, a silent, grotesque performance of communal concern. "Any news, Gloria?" he had asked her once, a few months after the disappearance, his voice laced with a carefully feigned sadness. "We're all just praying for that girl of yours." The thrill of that deception, the sheer audacious power of it, was a drug. He was the only one in the world who knew the answer to the question that was slowly, publicly, torturing this woman, and the answer was locked in his upstairs bedroom. His control over Danielle was absolute. He had broken her will with a patient, methodical campaign of psychological warfare. The silence, the isolation, the complete and total dependency on him for her survival, these were his tools. He rarely used physical violence beyond the initial act of abduction. He didn't need to. The chain, the locked door, and the constant unspoken threat of what he was capable of were enough to ensure her perfect, terrified compliance. He was the quiet, unassuming man next door, the one no one would ever suspect. And in that invisibility, he had created the perfect, inescapable prison. For Gloria Carter, the years after Danielle's disappearance were a long, slow, and agonizing descent into a world of quiet desperation. The initial, frantic energy of the search, the brief, intense flurry of media attention, the hopeful, prayer-filled vigils, it all slowly, inexorably, faded away. The city of Baltimore, a place with a seemingly endless appetite for fresh tragedy, moved on. But Gloria could not. She was frozen in time, trapped in the amber of that rainy night in 1996. Her life became a dual existence. On the surface, she was a model of resilience. She continued to work her long shifts at the hospital, her professionalism a shield against the pitying glances of her colleagues. She paid her bills. She maintained her small, neat house. She functioned, but beneath the surface, she was a woman engaged in a relentless, all-consuming battle. A battle against forgetting. She refused to let her daughter become a cold case, a ghost in a filing cabinet. She became a reluctant activist, a warrior armed with a stapler and stacks of homemade flyers. She spent her days off walking the streets, taping Danielle's smiling face to telephone poles, to bus shelters, to the bulletin boards of community centers. The photo was from her high school graduation, a picture of a young woman on the cusp of a bright, hopeful future. With each passing year, the smiling girl in the photo seemed to mock the grim reality of her absence. Gloria became a familiar, slightly eccentric figure in the neighborhood. She was the mother of that girl who ran away. She could feel the subtle shift in her neighbors' attitudes, the way their sympathetic words were now tinged with a weary, unspoken judgment. They saw a woman who could not let go, who could not accept the simple, painful truth that her daughter had chosen to leave. Her most painful and frustrating battle was with the Baltimore Police Department. She would call Detective Russo's office once a month, her voice a familiar, pleading refrain. "Any news, detective? Any new leads?" The answer was always the same. A tired, bureaucratic sigh from a secretary, and then, if she was persistent enough, a brief, dismissive word from Russo himself. "Nothing new to report, Mrs. Carter. We'll call you if anything changes." She knew they saw her as a nuisance, a grieving mother clinging to a false hope. But she could not stop. To stop would be to betray Danielle. To stop would be to accept their narrative, to admit that her daughter was a runaway, and that was a lie she would not, could not, live with. Every year, on Danielle's birthday, she would hold a small, quiet vigil on the steps of their church. In the first year, dozens of people had come. By the 8th year, in 2004, the crowd had dwindled to just a handful of her closest friends and a few loyal members of the congregation. They would light candles, say a prayer, and release a single white balloon into the sky, a small, fragile symbol of a hope that refused to die. Gloria's life was a testament to a mother's unyielding faith. She kept Danielle's room exactly as she had left it, a perfect, heartbreaking time capsule of a life interrupted. The books were still on the shelf. The journal was still on the desk. The college acceptance letter was still pinned to the bulletin board. It was a room full of ghosts, of promises, of a future that had never been allowed to happen. It was her private sanctuary, the one place where she could feel close to the daughter she had lost. And it was the place that fueled her unending fight, a quiet, desperate battle to prove to a world that had forgotten that her daughter was not a runaway. She was a victim, and she was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. The cruelest dimension of Danielle's captivity was the sound. Her world was a silent, isolated box, but the walls were not entirely soundproof. Through the floorboards, through the thin plaster of the walls, the ordinary, mundane sounds of the outside world would filter in, each one a small, sharp instrument of torture. She could hear the distant, cheerful music of an ice cream truck on a summer afternoon, a sound that would transport her back to her own childhood, to a time of innocence and freedom that now felt like a story that had happened to someone else. She could hear the laughter of neighborhood children playing on the street, the sound of a basketball bouncing, the excited yelp of a dog. These sounds were a constant, taunting reminder of the vibrant, living world that was moving on, just a few feet away, without her. Her prison was not in a remote, isolated cabin in the woods. It was in the heart of her own community, a cell hidden within the familiar, comforting geography of her own life. And this proximity was a source of the most profound and exquisite agony. There were times when she could hear the voices of people she knew. Once, she heard the distinct, booming laugh of Mr. Henderson, the man who owned the corner grocery store. He must have been on the street below, talking to a neighbor. The sound, so familiar and once so comforting, was a dagger in her heart. He was so close. Freedom was so close, but it was a million miles away. The most terrible moments were when she heard her mother, Gloria, in her relentless campaign to keep her daughter's memory alive, would often organize small community events. There were prayer circles, neighborhood watch meetings, and block parties that were, in reality, just another excuse to hand out flyers and talk about Danielle. These events often took place on their own block, or the one next to it. And from her upstairs prison, Danielle could sometimes hear them. She would press her ear to the floor, her body rigid, her breath held tight in her chest, and she would listen. She could hear the faint, distorted sound of music. She could hear the indistinct murmur of a crowd, and then, like a single, clear note rising above a cachemire, she would hear it. Her mother's voice. It was a voice she knew better than her own, a voice that was the very sound of home, of safety, of love. But now, it was a voice strained with a grief that Danielle could feel, even through the thick floorboards. She would hear her mother speaking to the crowd, her words muffled and indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a tone of pleading, of a desperate, unbreakable resolve. In those moments, a primal, animalistic urge would rise up in Danielle. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw her body against the door, to rattle her chain, to make a sound so loud and so full of pain that it would shatter the windows and bring the entire, oblivious world crashing down around her. She wanted to scream, "I'm here! Mama, I'm here! Right here!" But she couldn't. The one and only time she had tried to make a sound when there were people outside, Harold Whitman's reaction had been swift, silent, and terrifying. He had entered the room, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. He had not hit her. He had not yelled. He had simply knelt down in front of her and spoken in a low, chilling whisper. "You hear them out there?" he had said, his voice a venomous hiss. "They're all the people who love your mother. Your neighbors, your friends from church. If you ever make a sound like that again, if you ever give me a reason to think you are a risk, I will walk out of this house, and I will choose one of them, and I will make sure your mother finds the body. Your silence is the only thing that is keeping them safe. Do you understand?" The threat, so calm, so specific, and so monstrous, had been a masterstroke of psychological terror. He had taken her last, desperate hope for rescue and had twisted it into a weapon against her. He had made her a complicit guardian of her own family's safety. Her silence was no longer a sign of her own defeat. It was now an act of profound, terrible, and selfless protection. And so, when she heard her mother's voice from the street below, she would curl into a tight ball on her mattress, her hand clamped over her own mouth, and she would cry, silent, agonizing tears for a freedom that was so close she could hear its voice, but so far away that she could never, ever reach it. By the early 2000s, the Danielle Carter file in the cold case archives of the Baltimore Police Department was more of a ghost than a case. It was a thin, forgotten folder, a testament to a story that the system had already finished writing. For Detective Frank Russo, who was now a senior detective, a man whose weary cynicism had settled into a kind of permanent, low-grade exhaustion, the name on the file would occasionally trigger a faint, uncomfortable flicker of memory. He would sometimes see Gloria Carter in the newspaper, in a small, human interest story that the local paper would run every year on the anniversary of Danielle's disappearance. He would see the photo of her, a woman who had aged more than the years should have allowed, her face a mask of determined, unwavering grief. He would read the story, the same one every year, about the mother who refused to give up, who still believed her daughter had not run away. In those moments, a brief, unwelcome pang of something that might have been guilt would trouble him. He would remember the frantic, angry woman on the phone from all those years ago. He would remember his own quick, dismissive judgment. Had he done enough? Had he listened closely enough? But then, the realities of his job, the constant crushing weight of new, more violent, and more immediate tragedies, would push the thought away. The city was a machine that produced victims with a relentless industrial efficiency. His job was to deal with the bodies that were in front of him, not the ghosts of the ones who had simply walked away. The Danielle Carter case was, in his professional, statistical analysis, a closed loop. An 18-year-old adult had vanished. There had never been a ransom demand, never a body, never a single piece of credible evidence to suggest foul play. The conclusion, however painful for the mother, was the only one that made logical sense. She had left. The system was designed to forget. Cases grew cold. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. The sheer volume of crime created a kind of institutional amnesia. There were simply too many stories, too many victims, to remember them all. The thin file of a runaway from a decade ago was a low-priority ghost in a precinct that was haunted by a legion of more violent, more demanding spirits. Russo's dismissal was not personal. It was systemic. He was a cog in a large, overwhelmed, and deeply flawed machine. A machine that was designed to process and categorize human tragedy according to a rigid, and often fallible, logic. The ghost in the system was not just Danielle. It was the thousands of other forgotten names, the faces on the faded flyers, the stories that had been written off and filed away. They were the quiet, invisible casualties of a system that was too broken, too busy, and too tired to listen. For Danielle, trapped in the timeless, monotonous void of her upstairs prison, the world of books and journals, of plans and dreams, seemed like a distant, half-forgotten myth. The initial terror and despair of her captivity had, over the long, slow years, settled into a kind of grim, functional reality. Her survival depended on a delicate, precarious balance, a perfect, outward compliance to appease her captor, and a fierce, secret, and unwavering internal resistance to keep her own mind from breaking. Her body was a prisoner, but her mind, she was determined, would remain free. And so, in the silent, empty hours that made up her days and nights, she began to create a new kind of journal. It was not a journal of paper and ink, but one of memory and recitation. It was her mental journal, a secret, internal world where she could retreat, a fortress of the mind that Harold Whitman could never touch. The process began as a simple exercise to combat the soul-crushing boredom. She started by reciting the plots of her favorite books. She would walk through the stories of Jane Eyre, of Huck Finn, of every novel she had ever loved, chapter by chapter, sometimes line by line. She would reconstruct the worlds, the characters, the dialogues, her mind a solitary stage where the great stories of literature were performed for an audience of one. It was a way of filling the silence, of populating her barren world with the rich, complex lives of others. From there, the mental journal grew more personal, more profound. She began to meticulously reconstruct her own life, a conscious, deliberate act of remembering who she was before she had become a prisoner. She would start at the beginning, with her earliest childhood memories, the taste of her grandmother's peach cobbler, the feeling of her mother's hand in hers as they walked to the park, the specific comforting smell of her own childhood bedroom. She would spend hours, sometimes days, on a single memory, turning it over and over in her mind, polishing it like a precious stone, terrified that the details might fade with time. She would mentally walk through the halls of her high school, recalling the names of her teachers, the faces of her friends, the layout of the classrooms. She would recite her college plans, the curriculum for the early childhood education program, the names of the professors she had hoped to study with. This was not just a nostalgic journey into the past. It was an active, strategic battle against the corrosive effects of her captivity. Harold Whitman's goal was to erase her, to reduce her to a compliant, nameless object. Her mental journal was her act of rebellion. It was a daily declaration that she was still Danielle Carter, a person with a history, with relationships, with a future that had been stolen but not forgotten. She would hold silent, imaginary conversations with her mother. She would tell her about her day, about the patterns she had found in the wallpaper, about the books she had reread in her mind. She would ask her mother for advice. She would feel the comforting, imagined presence of her love. It was a lifeline, a way of keeping that essential bond alive across the impossible, silent distance of two city streets. Her mind became a sanctuary, a library, a fortress. It was the one part of her that remained sovereign, the one part of her that was truly, unshakably free. While her body was chained to the floor of a locked room, her mind was soaring, remembering, and, most importantly, enduring. The mental journal was her quiet, invisible, and ultimately triumphant act of survival. Hope is a resilient, stubborn thing. For years, Danielle's hope for rescue had been a flickering, tormented flame, a thing she had to alternately nurture and suppress to survive. But after a decade of captivity, the hope for an outside intervention had all but died, starved of any light or air. She understood, with a chilling, pragmatic clarity, that if she was ever going to be free, she would have to free herself. The catalyst for this shift was a small, almost insignificant discovery. During one of her rare, brief periods out of her chain for cleaning, she had found something on the floor, hidden under the loose edge of a floorboard. It was a single, old, rusty nail. It was not much, but in her barren, toolless world, it was a discovery of monumental significance. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was a spark. She hid it, smuggling it back to her mattress, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a new, unfamiliar feeling, a surge of fierce, determined purpose. She had no clear plan. She only knew that she now possessed a tool, a means of leaving a mark on her prison. The idea came to her slowly, over many weeks of silent contemplation. She could not break the door. She could not break the bars on the window. But the walls were made of old, soft plaster. She could write on them. She could leave a message. The project became her life's secret, central focus. It was an act of incredible, painstaking labor, performed in the silent, stolen moments when she was sure Harold was asleep or out of the house. Lying on the floor, her body contorted to reach the wall near the baseboard, she would use the tip of the rusty nail to slowly, laboriously, scratch letters into the plaster. The work was slow, arduous, and almost silent. The gentle, rhythmic scraping of the nail against the wall was a sound that was easily masked by the other ambient noises of the house. Each letter was a small, personal victory, a tiny act of defiance against her captor. She chose her words with a desperate, poignant simplicity. She didn't write a long, elaborate plea for help. She wrote a simple, direct message to the one person in the world she knew was still looking for her, the one person whose love was a constant, unwavering certainty in her mind. The first letter, an M, took her over a week to complete. The plaster was harder than she had thought, and the nail was a clumsy, inefficient tool. Her fingers would ache, her muscles would cramp, but she would not stop. As the first word, Mom, began to take shape on the wall, a profound sense of power, of agency, filled her. She was no longer just a passive victim, waiting for her fate to be decided. She was an actor. She was a communicator. She was sending a message in a bottle from a deserted island. Over the course of many months, the full message was completed. It was a simple, heartbreaking, three-word declaration of existence, a silent scream carved into the very structure of her prison. Mom, I'm here. She would run her fingers over the rough, indented letters in the darkness, the words a tactile, physical confirmation of her own survival. The message was her testament, It was her legacy. She had no idea if it would ever be seen. She had no idea if anyone would ever come. But she had refused to be silent. She had refused to be erased. She had taken the only tool she had, and she had carved her truth into the wall. It was an act of faith, a desperate, beautiful, and ultimately heroic belief that someday, somehow, her message would be read. By the year 2008, Harold Whitman had settled into the comfortable, mundane routine of his monstrous secret life. The initial, high-stakes thrill of his crime had long since faded, replaced by the simple, domestic reality of being a full-time jailer. 12 years had passed. The world had forgotten about Danielle Carter. The police had written her off. Her mother was a familiar, sad, but ultimately harmless figure in the neighborhood. He had, in his own mind, committed the perfect crime. His confidence had grown into a kind of lazy, careless arrogance. The meticulous, paranoid caution of the early years had given way to a sense of absolute, unassailable security. He had gotten away with it for so long that the possibility of being caught no longer felt like a real, tangible threat. It was a distant, abstract concept. His control over Danielle was, he believed, total. She was a quiet, compliant, and broken creature, a part of the house's furniture, no more threatening than the old armchair in the living room. He no longer saw her as a person, but as a feature of his life, a secret pet, a living trophy that was a testament to his own cleverness. This complacency made him sloppy. He would sometimes leave the bolt on her door unslid for a few minutes while he was in the house. He would talk on the phone in the hallway, his voice clearly audible to her, discussing his handyman jobs, the weather, the mundane details of his public life. These small lapses in security were a sign of how completely he underestimated her. He had forgotten that beneath the broken, submissive exterior he had so carefully cultivated, there was a mind that was still working, still observing, still hoping. His routine was the very picture of suburban banality. He would wake up, have his coffee, and go out for his handyman jobs. He would come home, make himself dinner, watch television, and then, as a final, routine chore, he would take a tray of food up to the prisoner in his upstairs bedroom. It was no different than feeding a dog or watering a plant. It was just a part of his day. The monster had become a boring, middle-aged man. The horror had become a routine, and it was this very routine, this comfortable, predictable, and arrogant sense of normalcy that would be the catalyst for his downfall. He had created a perfect, invisible prison, but he had failed to account for the one thing that can undo even the most perfect of plans: the simple, unpredictable, and random intrusion of the outside world. A world of power grids, of faulty wiring, and of diligent, observant utility workers. The routine of the monster was about to be interrupted. The beginning of the end for Harold Whitman did not come in the form of a brilliant piece of detective work or a dramatic, last-minute confession. It came in the form of a flickering light in his kitchen. For weeks, the overhead light had been acting up, a symptom of a larger, older wiring problem in the pre-war row house. On a Tuesday morning in the summer of 2008, a circuit finally blew, plunging half of his house into darkness. With an annoyed sigh, he did what any normal citizen would do. He called the power company. A few hours later, a Baltimore gas and electric utility truck pulled up in front of the house. The man who got out was named Dave Henderson, a veteran lineman in his late 50s, a man who had seen the inside of 1,000 Baltimore basements and attics. His job was to follow the wires, to find the fault, and to fix it. Harold, playing the role of the slightly inconvenienced but friendly homeowner, let him in. "It's the wiring in these old houses," Harold said with a folksy, commiserating shrug. "Always something." Dave Henderson went about his work with a practiced, methodical efficiency. He started in the basement, checking the main fuse box. He found the problem quickly, an old, frayed circuit that was a serious fire hazard. He informed Harold that he would need to access the junction boxes on the second floor to replace a section of the wire. A flicker of something panic, annoyance, crossed Harold's face, but it was gone in an instant. Sure, whatever you need to do," he said, his voice a little too tight. Dave went upstairs, his heavy work boots clumping on the old wooden steps. He followed the wires into the hallway. The junction box he needed to get to was on the wall right next to a closed, locked door. As he opened the panel and began to work, he became aware of a sound, a faint, rhythmic, and unusual sound. It was a soft, scratching noise. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from inside the locked room. "You got rats in here or something?" Dave asked, his voice casual, his focus still on the wires. "Yeah, mice." Harold, who had followed him upstairs, answered quickly, a little too quickly. "Been trying to get rid of them for weeks. Set a bunch of traps." But the sound wasn't the frantic, skittering sound of a mouse. It was slow, deliberate, and methodical. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of Dave Henderson's neck stand up. He was a man who had spent his life working in the quiet, hidden spaces of other people's homes. He had a finely tuned ear for things that were out of place. And this sound was profoundly, unnervingly out of place. He finished his work on the wiring, his mind preoccupied with the strange noise. As he packed up his tools, he looked at the door. It had a heavy, industrial-grade deadbolt on the outside. It was a strange, unsettling detail for an interior bedroom door. He looked at Harold Whitman. The friendly, folksy homeowner seemed nervous now, his eyes darting towards the locked door, his hands fidgeting. Dave Henderson was not a cop. He was not a hero. He was just a utility worker. But he was also a citizen, a father, and a man with a gut feeling that was screaming at him that something was terribly, terribly wrong inside that locked room. He finished the job, packed his truck, and drove away. But the sound, the scrape, 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 and the image of the dead-bolted door stayed with him. He drove a few blocks away, pulled over to the side of the road, and took out his cell phone. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a surge of doubt. Was he overreacting? Was he about to make a fool of himself? Then he thought of the look in Harold Whitman's eyes. It was not the look of a man who was annoyed by mice. It was the look of a man who was guarding a terrible secret. He dialed 911. "I'm not sure what this is," he said to the dispatcher, his voice quiet but firm, "but you need to send a car to the house I just left. There's something wrong in that house." The accidental witness had made his report. The outside world, after 12 long, silent years, was finally knocking on the door of Danielle Carter's prison. The dispatch call that came over the radio in Detective Frank Russo's unmarked sedan was a low priority, run-of-the-mill assignment. A check on the well-being call, based on a third-hand vague suspicion from a utility worker. It was the kind of call that 99 times out of 100 turned out to be nothing. A neighborhood dispute, a paranoid resident, a simple misunderstanding. Russo, now a gray, weary detective just a few years from retirement, took the call with an annoyed sigh. It was a waste of his time. He pulled up to the address, a familiar, unremarkable street of brick row houses. As he ran the address through the system, a routine procedure, something flickered in the deep, dusty archives of his memory. The name of the homeowner was Harold Whitman, but the address was connected to an old, long-forgotten missing persons case, a runaway girl named Danielle Carter. He remembered the mother, the fierce, angry woman who had refused to believe her daughter had left voluntarily. A strange, cold feeling, a feeling he hadn't had in years, began to creep up his spine. It couldn't be. It was an impossible, ridiculous coincidence. He met the uniformed officers who had responded to the initial call. They had spoken to the homeowner, Harold Whitman, who had been polite, cooperative, and had calmly explained that the scratching sound was a new puppy he was trying to house-train in the spare room. It was a perfectly plausible explanation. The uniforms were ready to close the call and move on. But Russo's gut, the old, cynical, and almost dormant instinct that had made him a good detective, was screaming at him. The runaway girl, the locked door, the strange call from the BGE worker. The pieces didn't fit. "Let's talk to him again," Russo said, his voice quiet, his eyes fixed on the front door of the house. Russo knocked on the door. Harold Whitman answered, his face a mask of polite, slightly annoyed concern. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Mr. Whitman," Russo began, his voice casual, friendly. "We're just following up. You mind if we take a look in that upstairs room? Just to put the matter to rest." The mask on Whitman's face tightened. A flicker of panic appeared in his eyes. so brief that a younger cop might have missed it. But Russo saw it. "I'd rather you didn't," Whitman said, his voice strained. "The puppy's a rescue. He's terrified of strangers." It was the wrong thing to say. It was a denial, a refusal. And in that moment, Russo's suspicion hardened into a cold, absolute certainty. "Mr. Whitman," Russo said, his voice losing all its feigned friendliness, "I'm going to get a warrant. You can either open that door now, or I can come back in an hour with a battering ram. It's your choice." The standoff was a brief, silent battle of wills on the front porch of a quiet, suburban house. Whitman's facade finally, completely, crumbled. His face contorted in a mask of pure, defeated rage. He knew the game was over. With the warrant secured, the entry was a swift, formal, and terrifyingly anticlimactic event. 2 officers forced the front door. They climbed the stairs, their footsteps a thunderous announcement of a long-overdue justice. They reached the locked bedroom door. The deadbolt, which had been a symbol of absolute, unbreakable control for 12 years, was now a flimsy, pathetic obstacle. They broke the door down. The room they entered was a scene of almost unimaginable squalor and despair. It was dark, the air thick and stale, and in the center of the room, on a thin, filthy mattress, was a figure, a pale, skeletal, and impossibly thin young woman, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, disbelieving hope. She was chained to the floor. It was Danielle Carter. As the officers flooded into the room, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, they saw the wall behind her. Scratched into the plaster, in a line of desperate, uneven letters, was a message, a silent scream that had been waiting 12 years to be heard. "Mom, I'm here." The unlocking of the door was the unlocking of a 12-year-old secret, a truth so monstrous and so close to home that it defied all reason. The discovery of Danielle Carter, alive, in that upstairs room was a moment that would be forever burned into the memories of every officer who was there. The silence of the room was finally broken, not by screams, but by the quiet, professional, and compassionate voices of her rescuers. The long, terrible night was finally over. The reunion was not a scene of cinematic, joyful tears. It was a quiet, sacred, and almost silent moment of profound, soul-shattering recognition. When Gloria Carter walked into the sterile, brightly lit hospital room, she saw a stranger. The woman lying on the bed was a pale, impossibly thin creature with wide, haunted eyes and hair that had lost its color. She was a ghost, a specter of the vibrant, healthy, 18-year-old girl who had been stolen from her. Gloria stopped in the doorway, her mind unable to bridge the chasm of the 12 years that separated the daughter in her memory from the woman in the bed. And then the woman spoke. Her voice was a dry, raspy, and barely audible whisper, a sound that had not been used for conversation in over a decade. But it was a voice that Gloria would have recognized anywhere in the world. "Mama," the single word, so full of a child's longing and a survivor's pain, shattered the last of Gloria's composure. She collapsed at the bedside, her hand reaching out, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar, sharp angles of her daughter's face. The tears she had held back for 12 long, hard years finally came, a silent, scalding flood of grief, of relief, of a rage so profound it had no words. Danielle's own eyes filled with tears. But she did not sob. She simply looked at her mother, her gaze a mixture of a deep, ancient sorrow and a dawning, disbelieving wonder. After 12 years of reciting her mother's face in her mental journal, of hearing her voice in the muffled sounds from the street, she was real. She was here. "I never ran away," Danielle whispered. The words a release, a validation, a final, definitive rejection of the false narrative that had defined her absence. "I know, baby," Gloria choked out, her voice thick with tears. "I always knew. That was the moment that mattered. That was the moment of true rescue." It was not the breaking down of the door. It was the breaking down of the wall of silence and disbelief that had separated a mother and a daughter for 12 agonizing years. The police, when they had processed the scene in the upstairs bedroom, had shown Gloria a photograph of the wall. She had stared at the image of the words her daughter had so painstakingly carved into the plaster. "Mom, I'm here." It was a message that had been sent from a place of unimaginable darkness and despair, but it was also a message of incredible, unshakable faith. a faith that her mother was still out there, still looking, still listening. It was the most profound and most heartbreaking love letter she had ever received. The story of Danielle Carter's rescue became a national sensation, a horrifying and captivating tale of survival and the monstrous secret of a quiet suburban street. Harold Whitman was arrested, his friendly, neighborly mask finally torn away to reveal the cold, calculating monster beneath. The community was left in a state of shocked, horrified disbelief, forced to confront the terrifying reality that a predator had been living, unseen, in their midst for decades. For Detective Frank Russo, the case was a final, brutal lesson in the fallibility of his own judgment. The ghost from his cold case file had returned, not as a statistic, but as a living, breathing testament to a catastrophic failure. A failure to listen, a failure to believe. But the final, defining scene of the story did not take place in a courtroom or a police precinct. It took place in the quiet, sunlit hospital room, where a mother and a daughter, separated by 12 years and 2 city streets, began the slow, painful, and beautiful process of finding their way back to each other. The world outside would talk of the monster, of the crime, of the failure of the system. But in that room, there was only the quiet, powerful, and unbreakable truth of a mother's love and a daughter's incredible, enduring will to survive. The arrest of Harold Whitman sent a seismic shockwave through the quiet, working-class neighborhood of Baltimore. The story was a media firestorm, a chilling, captivating narrative that played out on the national news for weeks. The central, horrifying question that everyone asked was the same. How? How could a young woman be held captive for 12 years in a normal-looking house, on a normal-looking street, without anyone knowing? The answer, as it slowly emerged, was a damning indictment of a system that had failed and a community that had been blind. The case of Danielle Carter became a national symbol of the missing. The thousands of adults, particularly women of color, whose disappearances are written off, whose families are ignored, and whose stories are never told. Harold Whitman's trial was a brief, sober affair. Faced with the overwhelming physical evidence from the room and the powerful, unshakable testimony of his victim, he accepted a plea deal that would ensure he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. He remained silent and impassive throughout the proceedings, a gray, unremarkable man who was horrifying in his sheer, banal evil. The most powerful moment of the trial came during the victim impact statement. Danielle was not there. Her recovery was a long, slow process, and her doctors and therapists had advised against the trauma of a public appearance. Instead, her mother, Gloria Carter, stood before the court. She did not yell. She did not cry. She spoke with a quiet, controlled, and devastating dignity. She turned her gaze directly to Harold Whitman, who refused to meet her eyes. "My daughter Danielle was 18 years old when you took her," Gloria began, her voice a low, steady anchor in the silent courtroom. "She was full of dreams. She was going to be a teacher. She was going to make a difference in this world. And you stole that. You stole 12 years of her life." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "But the thing I can't ever forgive you for," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the closeness. You lived 2 streets away from me. 2 streets. I walked past your house every single day on my way to work. I put up flyers on the telephone pole on your corner. I organized search parties that walked right down your block. You watched me. You watched me grieve for 12 years, knowing you had my baby locked in your house. We have Raiden the Smyers." Her final words were not for the judge or the jury. They were for him. A final, damning judgment from the woman whose life he had so casually and so cruelly destroyed. "You didn't just steal my daughter's life. You made me live next door to her ghost, and for that, there is no forgiveness." The case forced a painful reckoning within the Baltimore Police Department. It led to a complete overhaul of their policies regarding missing adults, particularly in cases where the family insisted that the disappearance was out of character. The Danielle Carter Law, as it became known, mandated a more thorough, immediate investigation in such cases, regardless of the victim's age. For Detective Frank Russo, the case was the final defining act of his career. He retired a few months after the trial, the ghost of his own failure a constant, unwelcome companion. He had been the one who had made the call, the one who had dismissed a mother's desperate plea. He knew that his mistake had not been born of malice, but of a weary, systemic cynicism, and that, in many ways, was a more damning and more difficult truth to live with. The story of Danielle Carter was a national tragedy, a cautionary tale about the monsters who live in plain sight. But for Danielle and Gloria, it was a quiet, personal story of survival and reunion. The journey of healing would be a long one. Danielle had to relearn the world. She had to get used to the simple, overwhelming sensations of sunlight, of open spaces, of human touch. But she was not alone. She had her mother, whose love was a fierce, protective, and unwavering shield. In the end, it was not the monster who had the last word. The final, most powerful statement was the one that had been scratched into a plaster wall with a rusty nail, a silent, desperate message from a girl who had refused to be forgotten. A message that was, in itself, a perfect, heartbreaking, and ultimately triumphant definition of hope. "Mom, I'm here.